Duke's wife invites Black Maid as a joke to mock her. But when she arrived, everyone was stunned. Victorian England, Ravenshire Manor, Devonshire. 1878. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the moors when the invitations were written. Margaret Whitmore, Duchess of Ravenshire, sat at her lacquered writing desk in the East Salon with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has conceived of a plan she considers both clever and amusing. The light through the tall windows was thin and grey, doing nothing to soften the angles of her face. Those high, cold cheekbones, the mouth pressed into a shape that suggested perpetual appraisal. She dipped her pen with the practiced ease of one accustomed to correspondence that carried consequence, and she wrote the names slowly, as though tasting each letter. Miss Clara Bennet. She set down her pen and permitted herself a small, satisfied smile. It had begun 3 days prior, at Lady Ashton's Thursday afternoon salon, when the subject of Ravenshire's new parlour-maid had somehow entered the conversation. Margaret had not introduced the topic herself. She rarely introduced topics that might reflect poorly on her household management. But once it was circling the room, she had been unable to resist shaping it. Someone had remarked with the carefully calibrated interest of a woman storing information that Margaret had taken on a black woman from the West Indies as personal staff. The observation was followed by a silence of precisely the sort Margaret despised, the kind that implied a question she was expected to answer. She had answered it, of course. She always answered it. But what she had said in Lady Ashton's rose-papered salon, surrounded by ostrich fans and pearl earrings and the amber scent of Darjeeling, was simply that the girl was adequate at her duties. Adequate. The word itself had been its own kind of dismissal, and the laughter that followed, quiet, knowing, the laughter of women who understood each other perfectly, had been satisfying, but not quite satisfying enough. And so the invitation was written. A soirée for Saturday next. 40 guests. The Viscount and Viscountess Pemberton. Lady Sophia Hartley and her thoroughly dull husband, the Marquis of Ashford, and Clara Bennet, parlour-maid of Ravenshire, daughter of a Barbadian seamstress and an English schoolmaster who had died of fever before his daughter could properly remember his face. An invitation extended not from any desire for the girl's company, but as one might set a curiosity upon a table, for the entertainment of those gathered to observe it. Margaret sealed the envelope. Outside, a rook called from somewhere in the yew trees, its cry flat and unmusical against the silence of the moors. She did not consider, in that moment, what Clara Bennet might do with such an invitation. She assumed what she always assumed about people she considered beneath her, that they would respond predictably, either with bewildered gratitude or mortified confusion, and that both responses would serve her purpose equally well. She did not consider the possibility of dignity. She had never found it necessary to consider that particular quality in servants. Clara Bennet received the ivory envelope on a Tuesday, delivered by the second footman with an expression of studied neutrality that told her he was working very hard to maintain it. She turned the thing over in her hands once, felt the weight of the paper, the quality of it, the way the wax seal bore the Ravenshire crest with its paired ravens and Latin motto, she had never troubled to translate, and then she set it on the small table beside her narrow bed and went about her duties for the rest of the morning without opening it. She opened it in the evening, after supper, in the pale yellow light of a tallow candle. She read it twice, then she folded it, returned it to its envelope, and sat for a long time, looking at the single window of her room, which gave not onto gardens or moorland, but onto the inner courtyard of the servants' wing, where the cobblestones glistened with the remnants of afternoon rain. Clara was 26 years old. She had come to England at 19 with her mother's blessing and a letter of introduction from a Methodist minister in Bridgetown. And she had worked in 3 houses before Ravenshire, each one a lesson in the particular grammar of English domestic service, with its unspoken hierarchies and its silences that carried more meaning than its words. She was not naive. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years reading rooms, exactly why this invitation had been extended. The question was not whether she understood the Duchess's intent. The question was what she would do with that understanding. She thought of her mother, who had been a seamstress of considerable skill in Bridgetown, who could look at a bolt of fabric and see in it not merely cloth, but possibility, who had taught Clara to move through the world, as though her presence in any room was not an accident, but a choice she herself had made. "You arrive on your own terms," her mother had said once, pressing a kiss to her daughter's temple on the morning Clara boarded the ship for England, "or you do not arrive at all." Clara picked up the invitation again and read it a 3rd time. Then she began to think, with considerable care, about what she would wear. The evening of the soirée arrived wrapped in one of those rare late autumn nights that Devon sometimes produces as if by apology. The sky washed to a deep, transparent indigo, the air carrying both the chill of the moor and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the village below. The candles in Ravenshire's great hall had been lit since 4 o'clock, and by the time the first carriages rolled up the gravel drive, the windows blazed against the darkening landscape like something out of a painting one might find in a modest gallery and think too romantic to be true. Lord Edward Hawthorne arrived in the 2nd carriage, alone. He was 31, heir to Hawthorne Park in Somerset, and possessed of a reputation that was in its own way as inconvenient as notoriety. He was considered thoughtful, which in certain circles was only marginally more forgivable than being considered odd. He had read too broadly, travelled too independently, and formed too many of his opinions through observation rather than inheritance, to sit entirely comfortably in the drawing rooms of Devonshire society. He came to events like this one out of a sense of obligation to friendships made in school that had not entirely dissipated with time, and because his mother worried when he refused invitations, and because, occasionally, he was wrong about his expectation that the evening would offer him nothing of interest. He descended from the carriage, handed his coat and hat to a waiting footman, and entered the hall with the particular composure of a man who has learned to be present in rooms where he feels only partially at home. The drawing-room was already well populated. Crystal caught the candlelight from the chandelier above. Conversation moved in overlapping currents. The particular music of 40 people engaged in the performance of social ease. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and spoke briefly with the Viscount Pemberton about a drainage issue on the Pemberton estate. And he was in the middle of forming a politely interested response to something the Viscount's wife was saying about her eldest daughter's progress at the pianoforte, when the sound of the room changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not the sudden hush of theatre. It was subtler than that, a kind of collective hesitation, as though 40 people had simultaneously paused to consider the same thing and were not yet certain what expression to adopt in response to their consideration. Edward turned toward the entrance of the drawing room without any particular urgency, following the general drift of attention, and saw her. She stood in the doorway with the ease of someone who had decided, before entering, that the room belonged to her no less than to anyone else in it. She wore a deep green silk, not the fashionable pale green of the season, but a green shade of old bottle glass or forest shadow, chosen with the instinct of someone who understands what colour does to the eye and the mind. Her hair was arranged with simple elegance, pinned back with a small jet ornament. Her posture was the sort that cannot be taught in any finishing school, because it does not come from instruction. It comes from something internal, harder won and more durable. She was, Edward realized with a clarity that surprised him, the most composed person in the room. He did not know, in that first moment, who she was. He only knew what he saw. A woman whose arrival had altered the atmosphere of a room full of people trained from childhood to believe that their own presence was the thing that mattered most in any gathering, and who did not appear to find this alteration particularly remarkable. Beside him, Viscount Pemberton cleared his throat. His wife said something very quietly to the woman standing next to her. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore's expression had frozen in a configuration that was attempting to maintain its smile while processing information that had not conformed to her expectations. Edward took a slow sip of his champagne and continued to observe. Clara had spent the week preparing for this evening. With the same methodical intelligence she brought to every task she considered worth doing properly. She had pressed her own dress. It had belonged to her mother, adjusted and resewn with considerable skill to accommodate the different architecture of Clara's frame. She had polished her single pair of good shoes until they reflected candlelight. She had read in the evenings after her duties were done a chapter of the book she always kept by her bed, currently a collection of essays by a Scottish philosopher whose name the other maids found unpronounceable. Not because she expected to discuss philosophy at Margaret Whitmore's soiree, but because it settled her mind, because it reminded her of who she was when no one else was watching. The walk from the servants' wing to the front entrance of Ravenshire Manor had taken 4 minutes. She had used them to recall her mother's voice and her own name, and the specific quality of the Barbadian sunrise she had watched from the stern of the ship as Bridgetown diminished behind her. That incandescent orange and rose, improbably beautiful, as though the island were performing one last insistence that it was worth remembering. She remembered it now, standing in the doorway of the Ravenshire drawing room. Absorbing the shift in the room's attention, with the steady interior calm of someone who had anticipated this moment and decided in advance what it would mean. It would mean nothing she did not permit it to mean. She moved into the room. The Duchess was near the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, her expression recalibrating with visible effort. Clara crossed toward her with the unhurried pace of someone who has been invited and is arriving at the appointed hour, which was, in fact, precisely what she was doing. "Your Grace," Clara said, with a composure so complete and so naturally offered that it managed to be neither subservient nor confrontational. Merely present, merely appropriate, merely the greeting of one person acknowledging another in a room they both occupied. Margaret Whitmore looked at Clara Bennett and said, "For the first time in several years, nothing at all." The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the drawing room made a series of adjustments. People who had been watching with the expectation of a particular kind of entertainment, the kind Margaret had designed this evening to provide, found themselves revising their expectations. The woman before them did not require the room's approval. That fact was legible in every line of her bearing, and it was, for many of those present, unexpectedly disorienting. They had prepared for embarrassment. They had not prepared for grace. It was Lady Sophia Hartley, a woman of moderate intelligence and genuine kindness, who stepped forward first. "Good evening," she said with the slightly overbright cordiality of someone filling a silence and meaning well by it.
Lady Sophia Hartley.
"I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Sophia Hartley." "Oh, Clara Bennett," Clara replied, and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray with the same ease she accepted anything. "What a lovely evening it is for early November." "It is rather," said Sophia, who was now completely sincere and slightly at a loss, which was not an unpleasant combination. And the room, after a moment more of suspended judgment, rearranged itself around this new fact and proceeded to do what rooms full of 40 people at a Devonshire soiree always eventually do. It continued. Edward found his way to her not through design, but through the reliable navigation of a drawing room that social convention provides, wherein the interesting person and the interested person gradually discover themselves occupying the same portion of space. He had been speaking with the Marquis of Ashford near the bookshelves when the Marquis was drawn away by his wife, and Edward turned and found Miss Bennet examining the painting above the mantelpiece. It was a landscape, the moor in autumn, done in the manner of Constable, without quite achieving Constable's luminosity. She was looking at it with genuine attention, the kind that does not perform itself. And Edward stood for a moment, simply watching that attention before he spoke. "It was commissioned by the second Duke," he said. "The painter was from Exeter, perfectly competent, but I have always thought he failed to capture the particular quality of light on the moor in late afternoon. There is something in it that he could not quite reach."
It has a quality of
She turned, and he saw her face fully for the first time. The precise, observant eyes, the particular stillness of her expression that was not distant, but rather the quality of someone who does not waste reactions. "He painted what he saw," she said. "But light on moorland in late afternoon is the kind of thing that changes while you're looking at it. Perhaps no painting could hold it. Edward considered this for a moment. That is a generous interpretation of his failure, or an honest one. He introduced himself. She introduced herself. The exchange of names was perfectly ordinary and entirely insufficient for what was, in fact, happening, which was that two people were recognizing, with the quiet precision of instruments tuned to the same frequency, that they were standing before someone worth the full weight of their attention. "You are not what I expected this evening," Edward said, because he was a man who preferred honesty to social performance when both were available.
Yes, that's it.
"What did you expect?" she asked, and her tone was neither defensive nor guarded. It was the tone of genuine inquiry.
I cannot agree to that.
"I
You
expected to
understand
drink
why. I know
adequate
why, but it must be
champagne
done
and
regardless
discuss
of my personal
drainage with men
reservations.
I have
That
known
is
since
precisely the
Eton,"
problem.
he said. "I did not expect to hear a sound observation about the impossibility of capturing transient light." Something moved briefly across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite its suppression,
Rain
and
in
was
Barbados
gone.
arrived suddenly. English
"The
rain is
champagne,"
different.
she
Considered,
said,
it thinks
"is
before it
better
comes.
than adequate." He laughed, which
I find it
surprised
kind.
him. He did not often laugh in rooms
find it
like
kind.
this one. Dinner was announced at 9. The seating arrangements, devised by Margaret with the expectation of a very different evening,
Must
placed
return to my
Clara
duties.
between the Reverend Horace
May I come
Millet,
again tomorrow?
a man of
catalogue
60
is
with
not
a
finished.
prodigious appetite and the conversational range of a well-meaning fence post, and a young baronet from Wiltshire named Sir Frederick Crane, who was 22, enthusiastic and entirely unequipped for the social complexity
deep
of the
sadness settled
situation
over the house
in
that
which he
winter.
now
But in
found
the
himself
quiet
seated.
moments, we
He
felt the
stared
heat of
at
midday.
Clara for the
My hands
first
would stood
several
still for a
minutes
moment,
with an
just like this.
expression of
And the smell
transparent
became
fascination
his. I can still hear
before
Mother's
his
voice.
manners reasserted themselves,
Dinner will be ready
and
soon.
he began
Dinner will be
speaking
ready
about
soon.
hunting.
Noted.
Edward was seated across the table, and 3 places to the left, between Lady Pemberton and a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, whose opinion on the Eastern question was unexpectedly developed. He participated in both conversations with the divided attention that dinner party etiquette demands. But he was also, with the remaining portion of his attention, watching Clara Bennet
Immediately to
navigate the
east salon,
table.
Clara.
Yes, miss.
What he observed was
Clara.
this. She was entirely at ease. Not the performed ease of someone maintaining a facade under pressure, but the genuine ease of someone who has decided that the terms of their engagement with the world are their own to set. She listened to Sir Frederick Crane with what appeared to be sincere interest, asking questions about his estate that demonstrated a knowledge of land management no one in the room would have anticipated. She engaged the Reverend Millet on a point of theological interpretation that made the
You
old
deserve
man
more
sit
care
up
than this house
straighter,
has offered you.
with the particular pleasure of a man whose favourite subject has unexpectedly arisen at table. She ate with the correct utensils in the correct order without appearing to think about it. She was, Edward
You don't have
thought,
to say what was
performing the
I want to tell you
remarkable
something.
trick of
What?
being entirely herself
The place
in
where
a
what I know
room
is true and
designed
what
to
I am
make her
permitted to have
feel
are not the
like
same thing.
something
I
else.
am less willing to accept that
He
gap
was
than I
not
have
the
ever
only one watching. At the
There's
head
a
of the
public
table,
lecture at the Exeter
Margaret
Philosophical
Whitmore
Society
had long
in
since
January.
abandoned the expression she had prepared for this evening and replaced it with something more careful, a watching quality, an assessment being revised in real time. She had expected disruption. She had wanted disruption. Instead, she had been given this, a woman whose presence at her table was neither disruption nor capitulation, but simply, stubbornly, existence. Margaret did not yet understand how unsettling she found this. She would not understand it fully until much later, when the house was quiet and she sat alone in the east salon, with her wine and the particular company of her own thoughts, which had a way of being more honest with her than she preferred. After dinner, in the drawing room over tea and port, the company redistributed itself into the smaller configurations that allow for actual conversation. Clara found herself near one of the tall windows, watching the moor through her own faint reflection in the glass.
Good evening.
The darkness outside absolute, the candlelit room behind her, blazing in the pane like a second, contained world. She was holding her cup and thinking about something her father had written in one of the few letters he had sent before his death, when she became aware of someone standing beside her. She did not need to look to know it was Edward Hawthorne. She had developed over the course of the evening a specific awareness of where he was in any room. Not the breathless awareness of romance, but something quieter and more unsettling. The awareness of someone whose quality of attention you have begun to recognize and cannot quite dismiss. "The moor at night," he said, looking where she was looking. "There's something about it, the way it erases everything that isn't immediate." "Yes," she said, "I find it reassuring in a way." He looked at her reflection in the glass rather than at her directly, and she understood this as a courtesy, the kind extended not from condescension, but from an instinct toward allowing a person their space while still being present in it. "May I ask you something direct?" he said. "You may ask. Are you all right? This evening was..." He paused, searching for the precise word. "I do not think it was designed with your comfort in mind." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Clara considered his reflection beside her own. The angular face, the quiet attention in the eyes, the expression of a man who asks because he genuinely wishes to know and has not yet found a way to protect himself from caring about the answer. "It was not," she said at last, "but comfort is not always the thing I require from an evening. What do you require from this one?" She turned then and looked at him directly, and the candlelight was warm between them, and the moor was dark behind the glass, and the noise of 40 people was a current they were standing slightly outside of. And she said, "To have arrived on my own terms, I believe I have managed that." Edward looked at her for a moment, the particular quality of look that does not catalogue but simply receives. And then he said very quietly, "Yes, I believe you have." The weeks that followed were unremarkable on the surface of things. Clara returned to her duties. The house moved through its November routines. Fires to be lit before dawn, silver to be polished, the Duchess's correspondence to be sorted. The particular rhythm of a great house in autumn that has the quality of a long, steady exhalation. Clara performed her work with her customary precision. She did not think, or tried not to think, about the evening of the soirée with any particular frequency. She did not succeed entirely. It was not that she permitted herself to dwell on Lord Hawthorne with any romantic intent. She was a woman of considerable practical intelligence, and she understood the landscape of her position in this country and this household with the same clarity she brought to understanding everything else. But there was something in the memory of that conversation at the window, The directness of it, the quality of his attention, the absence of the particular performance that most people in that room had been engaged in, that she found herself returning to, with the involuntary regularity of the mind seeking something that has fed it. She thought about what he had asked. "Are you all right?" Not performed concern, not the rhetorical solicitousness of social gesture, an actual question, offered in the expectation of an actual answer. She had given him one. She was not certain she had ever done that before. Given a person in that world an answer that was true and unguarded and offered without calculation. It had felt, she thought, on the Tuesday after the soirée, while polishing the third-floor candlesticks by early morning light, like something she would not easily find again. Edward wrote to the Marquis of Ashford in the second week of November, ostensibly regarding a matter of Parliament, and mentioned in passing that he intended to spend some weeks in Devonshire before removing to London for the winter. The Marquis replied that this was admirable, and that the Ashford hunting party in December would benefit from his presence. Edward agreed, and made no mention to anyone of the reason for his extended stay, in part because the reason was not fully articulated in his own mind, and in part because he was old enough to know that the mind often does its most honest work when not subjected to the pressure of articulation. He rode on the moor in the mornings, long solitary rides that cleared the particular congestion of thought that a London winter produced in him. He dined with the Marquis twice. He attended a very tedious lecture at the Exeter Philosophical Society on the subject of geological strata. He read, he thought about Clara Bennett with the increasing frequency of a man who has told himself he is not thinking about a particular person, and has thereby guaranteed that he thinks of little else. What he thought was not simple. He was not a simple man. He understood, had always understood with a clarity his social peers often found inconvenient, that the world, as it had been arranged, did not accurately reflect the world as it ought to be. He had read the abolitionists at school, not as a required text, but as a revelation. He had argued with his father at 20 about the nature of merit and the accidents of birth. He had come to his current positions through genuine inquiry rather than fashion, which meant they were not easily dislodged by discomfort, but were also not available for the kind of romantic self-congratulation that sometimes afflicts men who consider themselves enlightened. He knew that what he felt when he thought of Clara Bennett was genuine. He also knew that the world that surrounded them, the drawing rooms and dining tables, and the entire elaborate architecture of English society in the year 1878, was not a neutral medium through which two people could simply choose one another without consequence. He knew what the consequences would look like. He had seen them applied to others with less cause. He rode through the heather and thought about all of this with the honesty of a man alone on a moor, with no audience to perform for. And he arrived at nothing certain, except that he intended to see her again, and that this intention was not one he was prepared to dismiss, simply because it was inconvenient. The occasion presented itself in the form of the Ravenshire Library. Clara had been assigned on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of November to dust and catalogue the library's lower shelves. a task that had apparently been deferred for some months
return to my duties.
and required several hours of methodical attention.
The catalogue
She
is
was
not
on the
finished.
fourth shelf, working her way along a section of natural philosophy texts, when she heard the door of the library open and close, and then footsteps. Not the footsteps of the butler or any of the other staff, but the longer, less apologetic stride of someone who is accustomed to inhabiting rooms fully. She did not turn. She continued her cataloguing, because she had learned that the safest default when a member of the gentry entered a room she was working in was to continue working until addressed. "I understand you're undertaking the catalogue," said Edward Hawthorne's voice. "I hope I am not in the way." She turned then. He was standing near the central table, hat already in his hand, which suggested he had come directly from his coat and boots, that he had not taken the time he might have taken, that the directness with which he had arrived in this room was not accidental. "You are a guest, Lord Hawthorne," she said. "This is your host's library. You cannot be in the way." "That is a very precise answer to a question I did not quite ask," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You asked whether you are in the way." I answered. "Whether you are welcome is a separate question." "And are you going to answer that one as well?" She turned back to her shelf. "The Duke of Ravenshire has a very poor cataloguing system," she said.
You deserve more care
"His
than this
natural
house.
philosophy is interspersed with his travel narratives in a manner that serves neither category. It will take me some time to sort it." There was a pause. Then Edward moved to the opposite end of the shelf
You don't have to
and,
say
without
what was said,
further preamble,
but I want to tell you
began
something.
examining the
What?
titles. "This one," he said, pulling out a volume,
belongs
"belongs with the natural philosophy. It is a geological survey of the West Country
There
done
is a
in
public lecture at the
1843,
Exeter Philosophical
thoroughly
Society in
researched,
January.
though the author's prose style is an affliction." She looked at the book he was holding, and then at him. "You are going to help me catalogue the library," she said. "I have the afternoon free," he said, "and I have been looking for a reason to spend it somewhere other than the smoking room." They worked for 2 hours in a room full of afternoon light, and the smell of old paper, and the particular silence of two people who have agreed, without stating so, to see what occupies the space between them when neither of them is performing anything at all. They discuss the books, genuinely, with the specificity of people who have read rather than merely owned volumes. And then other things, the way conversation moves when it is alive. Darwin, whom Clara had read and found persuasive. The Jamaica question, and the nature of imperial governance, which they discussed with the discomfort of two people who do not agree entirely, and who find that disagreement against expectation more interesting than agreement would have been. Her childhood in Barbados, which she offered in brief fragments, the heat of midday, the smell of the cane fields at harvest, the sound of her mother's voice threading through the hum of the sewing machine, and which he received with the quality of attention that does not reach but waits at 5 o'clock, when the light through the library windows had deepened to amber and the footsteps of the house were beginning to move toward the preparations for supper. Clara closed the notebook she had been using for the catalogue and said, "I should return to my duties." "Yes," Edward said. He was leaning against the central table with a book he had been ostensibly reading while she worked. She had noted with a steadiness she chose not to examine that he had turned only 4 pages in the last hour. He straightened. There was something in his face, in the careful management of whatever it held, that she recognized as the expression of a person who is speaking only part of what they mean because the remainder has not yet found the form in which to be safely offered. "May I come again tomorrow?" he said. "The catalogue is not finished." Clara picked up her notebook. The afternoon light was gold on the old spines of the books. Outside, somewhere on the moor, the wind had begun to move. "The catalogue," she said, "is likely to take several days." She left him standing in the amber light, and she walked back through the corridor with her heart performing, quietly and without her full permission, a thing she had not asked it to do. He came the next day, and the day after that. The catalogue continued. The library arranged itself around them. A neutral space, neither his world nor hers, organized by the shared currency of books and attention. They read passages aloud to each other occasionally. They argued twice, with the particular vigor of people who argue because they trust the other person's ability to withstand their honesty. On the 4th afternoon, the rain came in from the moor with a force that rattled the windows and filled the room with the smell of wet stone and heather. And Clara set down her notebook and simply stood for a moment, listening to it. And Edward, watching her, thought that he had never seen anyone inhabit a moment of stillness so completely. "You love rain," he said. It was not a question. "In Barbados," she said, not turning, "rain arrives very suddenly and very seriously, as though it means to make a point. English rain is different. It is more—" She paused, searching. "Considered, considered," he repeated, tasting the word. "It seems to think about coming before it comes," she said. "I find that—" She stopped again, and he waited. "I find it kind," she said at last, and there was something in her voice, a quiet, private quality, the voice of a person who had said something true that they had not intended to say aloud. He said nothing. The rain moved against the glass. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the half-hour. He was standing 6 feet away from her, and the distance felt, in that moment, like something with a texture, like the quality of an absence rather than a space, like something that could, if circumstances were different, be crossed in 4 steps and a decision. He did not cross it. He understood with the clarity of a man who has spent a great deal of time being honest with himself in solitary spaces, that what he felt in this library was not infatuation, the light thing, the conditional thing, but something older and more serious, the feeling of recognition, of having found, in an unlikely place, in the wrong room of the wrong house, in the wrong configuration of the world, someone whose interior life rhymed with his own. He also understood with equal clarity that recognition is not the same as permission, that the world they both inhabited had opinions about what he was recognizing and would not hesitate to express them. He turned back to his books. The rain continued. The afternoon passed. Margaret Whitmore became aware of the library visits on the 6th day, through the reliable medium of household gossip. which she received from her lady's
Well, I must
maid,
confess, I hadn't
in
given
the
it much
form
thought.
of an apparently casual observation, delivered while her hair was being arranged for dinner. The observation was brief and specific. Lord Hawthorne had been spending his afternoons in the library with the cataloguing maid. Margaret dismissed her maid with a steadiness that gave nothing away, and sat for a moment looking at her own reflection in the dressing-table mirror. She was a woman of 44. She had a husband who was pleasant and distant, and spent most of his time at his club in London. She had a social position she had worked to maintain, with a consistency and intelligence that were, in their way, as real as any form of labour. She had arranged this world to her specifications, had furnished it with the right people, and the right events and the right distances between herself and anything that threatened to disturb its surfaces.
I will be.
She had not arranged for Clara Bennett to be the sort of person she was. She had not arranged for Edward Hawthorne to notice. She sat with this for a moment, and what she felt was more complicated than she had expected. There was anger, yes, the particular anger of a plan that has reversed its own intended effect. But there was also, underneath it, something more uncomfortable. The vague, unwelcome sensation of a woman confronting the difference between what she had told herself and what was true. She had invited Clara Bennett to humiliate her, and in doing so, she had placed before Lord Edward Hawthorne, a man of considerable reputation for judgment, a woman whose quality of character had made itself legible to that judgment within the space of a single evening. The social architecture she had built to diminish Clara Bennett had instead provided the stage on which Clara Bennett had become visible. Margaret rose from her dressing table. She chose her dining dress. She went downstairs. She said nothing to Edward at dinner, and nothing to Clara that evening. She was, for perhaps the first time in recent memory, genuinely uncertain of what she wished to do. The uncertainty was, she found, more disquieting than certainty would have been in either direction. The crisis arrived not with drama, but with the quiet irreversibility of weather on the 9th day of the library catalogue, on an afternoon of pale December light that gave the moor the quality of an old daguerreotype. Margaret entered the library without announcement. Clara rose immediately. The instinct of domestic service, the body's knowledge of its own position in the hierarchy, older than thought. Edward remained where he was, leaning against the table, a book in his hand, and looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who has been found out and has decided that denial is both beneath him and useless. Margaret looked at them both. The silence was of the kind that organizes itself around what people are not saying, that takes its shape from the outline of the withheld. "Miss Bennet," Margaret said at last, in a voice that was very controlled, "I require you in the East Salon, immediately." "Your Grace," Clara said, and turned to collect her notebook. "Clara." Edward's voice, her name, said simply, without title or decoration, and she heard in it the thing that had been building in the amber afternoons of the library, the full weight of an attention that had decided it was no longer willing to remain imprecise. She looked at him. His face was open in a way it was not always open. The particular openness of someone who has stopped calculating and simply arrived at what they feel. There was, in that openness, a kind of question that was not a question but a statement, that he was not willing to let what was between them be dismissed by the power of a room that did not belong to either of them. She held his look for 3 seconds, measured, internal, aware of every dimension of what those 3 seconds contained. Then she turned and followed the Duchess from the room. Edward stood in the library alone with the pale December light and the smell of old books and the particular silence of someone who has just understood that a moment has passed that will require a decision,
But I want to tell you
and
something.
that the decision
What?
cannot be deferred
At the place where
indefinitely.
what I know is true and what I am
The
permitted to
East
have are not the
Salon.
same thing.
A
I'm
fire,
less willing to accept
the
that gap
Duchess
than I have
standing with her back to the window, the moor grey
There
and
is a public
vast
lecture
behind
at the
her,
Exeter Philosophical
her arms
Society
folded in the
January.
manner of a woman who has composed what she intends to say and will now deliver it. I think you understand, Margaret began, that what is occurring in that library is inadvisable. We are cataloguing the library, Clara said. Clara. The use of her first name, not the affectionate usage, but the diminishing one. You are intelligent. Do not offer me the obvious fiction. Clara looked at the Duchess with the same quality of composure she had brought to the drawing-room door 3 weeks ago. What would you have me say, Your Grace? Margaret unfolded her arms and turned slightly toward the window. Something in her posture shifted, the rigidity of the prepared speech giving way, slightly, to something less rehearsed. I would have you understand, she said in a different register, that what you imagine may be possible is not possible. Not here, not in this country, not in this society.
Good evening.
She paused. You would be destroyed by it, and she stopped.
The gravity
And
of
he,
these circumstances,
Clara
ladies and
prompted
gentlemen,
quietly.
demands our
He is a
undivided
man who has
consideration.
never been required to pay the full price of his convictions, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice, something that surprised Clara, that did not sound like cruelty, that sounded like knowledge,
The cost.
like the knowledge of a
What a
woman
man
who
owes
has
to his
watched the
convictions,
world
if he holds them
operate at
only
close
until they are
range for many
inconvenient.
years. He will mean everything he feels, and the world will take most of it from him, and all of it from you, and he will recover in 10 years, and you will not. The fire snapped. Outside, the moor was immense and silent, and utterly indifferent to the 2 women standing before it. Clara thought, in the silence that followed, about what it meant to be warned by the very person who had invited you to a room as a joke. She thought about the particular texture of that irony. She thought about what it said about Margaret Whitmore. Not the cruelty she had expected and received, but this. The woman underneath the cruelty. The woman who apparently knew, from some source of experience Clara could not access, something true about the way the world behaved. I understand what you have told me, Clara said at last. Margaret looked at her. Do you believe it? A pause. I believe you believe it, Clara said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned back to the window. Go, she said, and be careful, not because I am telling you to, because you deserve more care than this house has offered you. It was the most honest thing, Clara thought as she left the room, that the Duchess had ever said to her. Possibly the most honest thing she had ever said to anyone in this house. The corridor outside the East Salon was cold, the winter light falling in long thin bars through the high windows onto the stone floor. Clara stood in it for a moment, alone, with the Duchess's words and the memory of Edward's open face in the library, and the entire complex weight of the question she had been carrying since the night she stood in a drawing-room doorway in bottle green silk, and decided that the room's judgment of her was not the thing that mattered most. She had known, even then, that decisions made in a single clear moment must eventually answer to the accumulated weight of the world as it actually operates. She had always known this. Her mother had taught her in the same lesson in which she had taught her to arrive on her own terms. Clarity of choice does not protect you from the cost of it. It only ensures that what you choose is truly yours. She walked back toward the servants' wing. The stone floor was cold beneath her feet. Edward was waiting in the corridor that connected the library to the main hall when she came back. Not waiting for her, he would have said, if asked, except that he was standing there with no apparent other purpose, and she was the only person who had been likely to come from that direction. "You don't have to tell me what was said," he said when she stopped. "I know," she said, "but I want to tell you something." He was very still. His voice was the voice she had come to recognize over the afternoons in the library.
You're great.
The voice stripped of the social lacquer, the one that meant what it said. "I am not unaware of," he paused, rearranging. "I am not someone who has arrived at this without
Lady
understanding
Sophia
where
Hartley,
he is
pleasure to
standing."
meet you at last. Character 1.
"Where do you think you are
Pleasure's all
standing?"
mine, my dear.
she
Welcome.
asked. "At the place where what I know is true and what I am permitted to have are not the same thing," he said. "And I find that I am less willing to allow that gap than I have been in the past." She looked at him in the winter corridor light.
His failure to
The
capture
bars of
quality
pale
light
sun had
on
shifted
moorlands.
with the hour,
The light shifts
and the
on
stone
moorland as
around
you
them
watch it.
was mostly in shadow
It never
now.
stays the same, does it?
And his
No, I
face
suppose
was
it
that
doesn't.
earnest, open thing that she had been afraid of since the first
not
time
expect
she
that.
saw it.
Nor I.
Because
to be honest,
openness in
neither
her
did I.
experience had a cost for the person you opened toward, rather than for the person who opened. "You should understand something," she said carefully. "What you feel in an afternoon in a library is not the same as what you would feel in the full light of the world,
What is your opinion
as it
on that?
exists
Well, I
beyond
must
this
confess,
house.
I hadn't given it much thought.
I know that." He did not say it quickly, the way a man dismissing a concern says things quickly.
I understand the passage.
He
as a
said it with the
metaphor for
weight of a
spiritual
man
awakening
who has
rather than
given the
literal
concern
translation.
its
Yes, a
full
most
consideration.
intriguing interpretation. Please do
And
elaborate.
I am not asking you for anything that the world would punish you for. I am only... He stopped,
I found the
tried
soil records
again.
regarding the easy
I am
question.
telling you that I am not willing to pretend between us that this is less than it is, whatever that means for what is possible. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere far away, the moor wind found a loose shutter and moved it once. "Edward?" she said. His name, the first time she had used it, and she felt the weight of it, the significance of having permitted it. What this is
Look at the moor
something
at
I
night.
also
It has a
know.
quality of erasing
I am
everything
not without my own
Yes.
honest accounting. She paused. But my honest accounting includes a wider landscape than an afternoon in December. "I know," he said. "I am asking for the chance to see more of that landscape.
My own terms.
Nothing more than that,
I
and
believe I
nothing
have managed
less."
I
She
believe you
stood
have.
in the winter light and thought about her mother, and her own name, and the Barbadian sunrise, and the colour of the moor in the rain. and the quality of a question asked in genuine expectation of a genuine answer. And she thought about what it meant to arrive on your own terms when the terms themselves were in dispute. She thought about all of this in the space of perhaps 8 seconds. Then she said, "There is a public lecture at the Exeter Philosophical Society in January on the history of the Atlantic trade routes. I intend to attend. I am told it is open to the public." Edward looked at her for a moment. Then, very quietly, "I have not previously been to a public lecture at the Exeter Philosophical Society."
The Darwinian theory. Its
"They are
implications on our
generally
understanding of natural
informative,"
philosophy are
Clara
profound.
said,
So you believe this
"and
extends
poorly
to the natural
attended
order
enough
itself?
I
that
cannot
one
agree
may
to that.
sit
You
where
understand
one
why.
chooses.
I know why, but it must be done regardless
She
of my
walked
personal
past him
reservations.
towards the
That is
servants'
precisely
wing.
the problem.
She did not look back. But she heard, behind her, the quiet exhale of a man releasing something he had been holding. December moved toward its close. The library catalogue was completed and delivered, a meticulous
Love
document in
Rain
Clara's
and
precise
Barbados arrive
hand,
suddenly.
organised
Each
by
rain is different.
subject and
Consider
date of
it. It's finished
acquisition,
before it comes.
with a separate appendix for the volumes
I find
that
it
required rebinding. The Duke of
find
Ravenshire,
it kind.
who returned from London for Christmas fortnight, was sufficiently impressed to remark upon it at dinner, which caused Margaret to say nothing at
Must
all
return to my duties.
and look at her wine glass
May I
with an
come again
expression her husband
The catalogue
did
is
not
not
trouble
finished.
to interpret. Edward removed to Somerset for Christmas, as family obligation required. He spent the fortnight in the familiar landscape of Hawthorne Park, the old stone house, the Somerset Hills in winter, his mother's questions about the coming season in London, his father's assessments of political matters, and he was present for all of it, attentive and adequate and dutiful in the way he had always been dutiful. But he was also, underneath all of it, somewhere else entirely. He wrote one letter during the Christmas fortnight. It was addressed in his careful hand to Miss Clara Bennet, care of Ravenshire Manor. He rewrote it 3 times. The final version was 4 sentences. It read, "I have been to see the Constable exhibition in Exeter. The real Constable, not the Ravenshire imitation.
Immediately to the east
The
salon,
light
Clara.
in the moorland paintings is extraordinary and impossible as you predicted. I have been rereading the Darwin you recommended. January is not so far as it feels from December." He did not sign it with his title. He signed it with his name. Clara received it on a Thursday morning, read it twice at the small table beside her window, with the pale December light falling across it, and placed it inside her copy of the Darwin, with the careful attention of someone preserving something that may require access again. She did
You
not
deserve
write
more
back.
care than this house has
She did
offered
not
you.
need to. January was not so far as it felt. The Exeter Philosophical Society lecture was held on the 14th of January, in a room that held perhaps 80 people, and smelled of
don't
coal
have to say
smoke
what was
and
said,
damp wool,
But I want to tell you
and the
something.
particular
What?
scholarly atmosphere
At
of
the
a
place
space
where what I know is
dedicated
true
to
and
the
what I'm permitted to
transmission of
have are not the
knowledge
same thing.
between
I am less
people
willing
who
to
have
accept
paid
that
a
gap than I
shilling to
have.
receive it.
Edward.
Clara arrived at 6:15,
There is a public lecture
having
at the
travelled
Exeter
the 12
Philosophical
miles
Society
from
in
Ravenshire
January.
by carrier's cart, an arrangement she had made herself, paid for from her own wages, and informed no one in the household of, because it was her afternoon off, and her choice, and her 12 miles, and those facts were sufficient authorization. She found a seat near the end of the 3rd row, removed her gloves, and opened the printed programme. Edward arrived 10 minutes later, having driven himself in a hired gig, rather than arriving in any vehicle that advertised his identity, because he was also, in his way, thinking about terms. He sat 2 seats away from her, not beside her immediately, because that would have announced something in a room that was not theirs to announce in, but within the ordinary conversational distance of 2 people who happened to have chosen the same row. He said good evening. She said good evening. They both attended their programs. The lecture was, in fact, interesting. A Scottish professor with a dry, digressive manner and a genuinely remarkable command of Atlantic trade history from the 16th century forward, with specific attention to the human cost of the triangular trade that most previous lectures in this series had apparently managed to discuss without quite acknowledging. Clara listened with the quality of attention that the subject deserved, and with the secondary awareness, steady and warm, and no longer entirely frightening, of the person sitting 2 seats away, who was also listening, whose presence in this room was a choice made in full knowledge of what it cost and what it offered. After the lecture, they walked together in the street outside. The January night very cold, their breath making brief clouds in the gaslit air. The sounds of Exeter around them, carriage wheels, a distant organ, the voice of a woman in an upper window calling down to someone below. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, speaking of the lecture and then of other things. And what the street offered them that the library had not was the full evidence of the world as it actually existed. The glances of a woman passing who looked at them both and looked away.
The rumours are simply dreadful.
The moment outside a tobacconist's shop, where a man Edward recognised tipped his hat and moved on with a fraction of a second's hesitation. And they did not ignore these moments. They incorporated them into the walk, into the conversation, into the honest knowledge of exactly where they were standing. She was right, the Duchess, Clara said at one point, looking ahead down the lamplit street, that there is a cost. Yes, Edward said, and you intend to pay it. I intend, he said carefully, that we not be the ones who decide what is impossible before we have tried the possible. He paused. I have been thinking these months about what I am willing to do with the convictions I have always held. A man who holds convictions only until they are inconvenient does not, I think, actually hold them. And a woman who allows another person's courage to become the ground she stands on, Clara said quietly, has not actually arrived on her own terms. No, he said, but I think there is a difference between standing on another person's courage and choosing to stand beside someone who has his own. The gaslight was amber between them. The January night pressed in from every side with its cold and its reality, and the world continued to be exactly what it was. Imperfect, arranged against them in ways neither of them could entirely overcome
Yes, that does sound
by
quite
the force
challenging.
of feeling, and neither of them pretended otherwise. I need more time, she said, not because I do not know what I think, but because what I think must be mine to be worth anything. Take whatever you need, he said, and she heard in it what she had been listening for since the first afternoon in the library. The absence of pressure, the presence of patience, the quality of a man who means what he says, because he has taken the trouble to mean only what he can sustain. They parted at the corner where the street forked towards the carrier's stopping point. She walked one way. He walked another. The city went about its January business around them, indifferent and continuous, and the space between their two departing figures was lit briefly by the passing of a carriage lamp before it went dark again. Spring came to Devonshire in early
Lady
April,
Sophia Hartley,
unreasonably
it's a pleasure to meet you at
early.
last.
The
Character
gorse
one.
across the
Pleasure is all
moor
mine, my
blazing
dear.
yellow
Welcome.
before March was properly finished. The sky opening itself to a blue that felt presumptuous after the long grey of winter. Clara, walking the path from the village back to Ravenshire after her weekly Sunday afternoon
The
off,
painter,
stopped
his
at the
failure
ridge
to capture
where
the
the
quality
moor
of light
opened fully
on
to the
moorland.
west, and
The light
stood in the
shifts on the
wind for a
moorland as
long
you watch it.
moment, with the whole
It
of
never
it
stays the
in
same,
front
does
of
it?
her.
No, I suppose
The
it
great
doesn't.
indifferent sweep of land and light, and the distant Atlantic
not
glitter
expect that.
far below the
You're right,
hills,
sir. To be honest,
and
neither did I.
thought about what she had decided. She had written to her mother in February. Her mother's reply had come 3 weeks later on paper that smelled faintly of the specific soap her mother had always used, and it contained, as her mother's letters always contained, the
Well, I
exact
must
thing
confess, I
Clara
haven't
had
given it much
needed.
thought.
Not instruction, not reassurance, but the reliable evidence of a woman who had made every choice
I
in her
understand
own
the passage
life
as a metaphor for
with
spiritual
full
awakening
knowledge of
rather
its
than literal
cost,
translation.
and had
Yes, a
not
most intriguing
regretted a
interpretation.
single
Please
one.
do elaborate.
You will know what it is when you know it. Her mother wrote, and when you know it, you will not require my permission to act on it. But you have my
What do they
blessing
show,
in
Martha?
advance,
I'm
in
Rich
case it
Place, Frederick,
helps.
ideal for the grazing
It
pattern
had
situation.
helped. She had written to Edward in March. Not 4 sentences, but a full letter. 2 pages, in which she said the things that had been organizing themselves in the months since January into the shape of what was true. She wrote about what she required from her life. The terms she had named to herself on the ship from
Look at the
Bridgetown,
moor at night.
and had
It has a
held
quality of
to
erasing
through
everything
3
from
houses and 8
Yes.
years, and the particular education
all right?
of being a black woman in Victorian England who refused to conduct herself as though her existence required apology. She wrote about what she had observed in him over the
To have
course
arrived
of the
on my own
autumn and
terms.
winter. She wrote that she was prepared
I
to
have
see
managed
what
that.
lay beyond the
I
library,
believe you have.
beyond the Exeter lecture, beyond the careful choreography of 2 people deciding what they were willing to risk, prepared to see it with her eyes open and on her own terms, which were the only terms she had ever agreed to. She wrote, "I am not a woman who arrives by accident. Whatever this is, I am choosing it." His reply had come within the week. He spoke of what he intended: to call on her formally, to make his intentions known to her directly and publicly, to bear the consequences of those intentions with the steadiness a man owes to the choices he makes. He wrote about what he understood the world to be,
Look at this.
and what he
This one
understood
here?
it could be
Yes,
made
that's
to
it.
accommodate by people who
The
refused
Darwinian theory.
quietly
Its
and
implications on our
persistently
understanding of natural philosophy
to
are
accept
profound.
its
So you
most
believe this
arbitrary
extends to the natural order
arrangements
itself?
as
I
law.
cannot agree to that.
He
You
wrote
understand why.
near the
I know
end,
why, but it must be
"I
done
have
regardless
thought
of my
this
personal
winter
reservations."
about what
That
it
is
means
precisely
to
the
know
problem.
someone. I have thought about the afternoon in the library when the rain came in from the moor and you said it was kind. I have thought that I do not know a great many people, though I have been in a great many rooms.
You love rain.
I think
Rain in
that is
Barbados
worth
arrives
something.
suddenly. English
Standing
rain is
on the
different.
ridge in the April
Considered, it
wind
thinks
with the
before it
gorse
comes.
blazing below her and the sky enormous
find it
above,
kind.
Clara thought about what it meant to have arrived. Not at a destination, not at safety, not at anything so simple as happiness. but at the knowledge of what you
Must
are
return to my
choosing and
duties.
why, which is
May I
the
come again
only
tomorrow?
foundation
The
on
catalogue
which
is not
anything
finished.
real has ever been built. She thought about her mother at the dock in Bridgetown, pressing a kiss to her temple. She turned away from the moor and walked back toward the house. Not quickly, not urgently, but with the particular ease of someone who
A deep
knows where she is
sadness settled over the
going
house that winter.
and has decided
quiet
before
moments,
arriving
we found
The
what
heat
it
of midday.
means.
My hands will
On the
stay still for a
second
moment,
Saturday
just
of
like this.
April,
And the smell
Lord
of the
Edward
cane fields,
Hawthorne
I can
called
still
at
hear
Ravenshire
Mother's voice.
Manor and requested,
Dinner
through
will
the
be ready
proper
soon.
channels,
Dinner will be
a
ready soon.
private conversation with Miss Clara Bennet. The butler received this request with an expression of absolute professional neutrality that cost him, his wife would later remark, considerable effort. He conveyed the message. Clara, who had been expecting it, had been prepared for it, had considered and chosen it, came downstairs in her good dress, the dark green silk, and received Lord Hawthorne in the morning
Immediately
room,
to the East Salon,
which was
Clara.
not the drawing
Yes,
room,
miss.
but
Clara.
was also not the servants' hall, and was therefore a room that belonged to neither of them in particular. Margaret Whitmore, who was told of this development by the housekeeper in the quiet of the following morning, sat with the information for a considerable time. She thought about the evening in October when she had written an invitation as a cruelty and a joke. She thought about what had come of it. She thought about Edward Hawthorne's reputation for judgment and what it meant that his judgment had reached, after full
You deserve more
consideration
care
of
than this
all
house
available information, this particular conclusion. She was not, she discovered, entirely without feeling on the matter. The feeling was not the one she had expected, not the hot, simple indignation she had prepared for.
You don't have to say what was said.
It was
But I
something
want to
more
tell you something.
complex
What?
and less comfortable.
At the place
The
where what I
feeling
know
of a
is true
woman
and
who
what
has
I'm
been
permitted to have are
shown
not the same
by
thing.
the
I am
unintended
less willing to accept
consequences
that
of
death
her
than I
own
am
action,
Deadwood.
something true about herself
There is a
that
public
she would have
lecture at the
preferred
Exeter
not
Philosophical
to see.
Society in January.
She did not interfere. She did not spread word through her social circle, though the opportunity was available. She sat in the East Salon in the April morning with the moor outside her window, and the particular company of her own honesty, which had become, in recent months, a more frequent visitor than she had previously permitted. It was not redemption. It was something smaller and perhaps more honest. The beginning of a reckoning she had been deferring for a very long time. There is no neat ending to a story that is, in its nature, a beginning. What happened after the morning room conversation? After two people sat across from each other in a house that was neither of theirs and chose, with their eyes open to every obstacle and every cost, to begin something they could not yet name with certainty, did not unfold without difficulty. The world, as the Duchess had correctly observed, had opinions. They were expressed as the world's
Good
opinions
evening.
generally are,
Good evening.
through the medium of social consequence.
The gravity
The
of these
invitations
circumstances,
not
ladies and
extended,
gentlemen,
the
demands our
conversations that
undivided
stopped at their
consideration.
entrance, the letter from Edward's mother that arrived in May, and required from him the most honest exchange he had ever had with a parent. These were real costs, paid by real people who had anticipated them and
Good
chosen
evening.
anyway,
Cost.
which is not the same as
What
not
a man
feeling them,
owes to his convictions,
but is the
if he
difference
holds them
between
only
a
until
cost
they are
freely accepted
inconvenient.
and one imposed without consent. What also happened is this. They attended public lectures and walked in public streets and spent long hours in conversation that never quite exhausted itself, because they were, between them, two people with enough interior life to sustain the sustained attention of the other. Edward argued before Parliament in June for a reform measure that surprised none of his allies and alienated several people he had previously considered friends. And Clara was in the gallery. She was writing by autumn pieces for a small progressive periodical. Essays on education, on the condition of women in service, on the question of belonging in an England that had not yet determined what it meant for certain people to belong.
Deserves every bit of it, wouldn't you agree?
And Edward read each one with the quality of attention she had first observed at the window in October, the quality that receives rather than reaches. On a November morning, almost exactly 1 year after an ivory envelope had arrived on a small table beside a narrow bed, Clara stood again on the ridge above Ravenshire. The moor in autumn, the heather bruised and beautiful in the low light, the Atlantic somewhere below the horizon. And she was not alone on the ridge. The man beside her was looking at the same landscape she was looking at, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he considered worth attending to. And neither of them was speaking, because the silence between them had, over the course of a year, become a comfortable country, a place with its own topography and its own weather, one they had learned to inhabit together. Below them, Ravenshire Manor sat in its parkland in the pale November light, its windows beginning to show the gold of early fires. The moor extended in every direction, ancient, unhurried, indifferent to the small human drama of the house below it, and beautiful for precisely that reason. "You know," Edward said after a time, "I have been attempting to describe this light to myself since October, and I cannot do it." "You don't have to describe it," Clara said. "No," he said. "I suppose I only have to be
that
here."
does sound quite challenging.
The wind moved through the heather. Below them, a light came on in the east salon, and then another, and the house filled slowly with its own warmth against the coming cold. The moor said nothing, as it had been saying nothing for a very long time. And the two figures on the ridge stood in it, not as an ending, but as two people at the particular place in a story where what has been chosen is beginning, finally, to be built. Clara did not look away from the moor, but she moved by 2 inches closer to the man beside her, and he, quietly, without ceremony, because the gestures that matter most rarely require them, moved to meet her. The November light held them for a moment longer.
Grace.
Then the wind shifted, and the clouds came in from the west, and the first drops of considered English rain began to fall.